Hello everyone, Mavuika the Pyro Archon is finally releasing in Genshin patch 5.3. As an Archon, the vast majority of people have high standards for Mavuika's kit, expecting her to be very powerful and be impactful in the meta like the Archons before her. And despite some community concerns and criticisms during her beta, which will likely still exist after her release, Mavuika is looking to meet these Archon expectations as an extremely strong DPS and support. With such an important and unique character coming out, I wanted to sum up all the updated information you need to know about Mavuika into one final guide. I will be explaining how Mavuika works, the best ways to build her potential best teams, and analyzing her place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value. Pretty much everything you need to know with simple and practical explanations, while also giving more detailed analysis that is backed by TC. As this time around, I will be showcasing calcs from multiple theory crafters that demonstrate Mavuika's strength. Mavuika is a 5-star Pyro Claymore user that ascends with crit damage. Notably, Mavuika is going to have the highest base attack in the game with 359. As the Archon of Notland, her kit heavily plays around the Night Soul mechanic and synergizes well with other Notland units. Mavuika has two main roles. She can be played as either an off-field support doing damage, providing buffs, and applying pyro, or as an on-field pyro main DPS that deals a lot of damage. And in both cases, Mavuika is looking to perform very well. Mavuika's two forms are outlined in her elemental skill, which has a 15-second cooldown and can be activated either by pressing or holding the skill. In both cases, when the skill is activated, Mavuika deals damage, generates 5 particles, and enters Night Soul's Blessing with 80 Night Soul points, which will slowly be consumed during the duration of her skill. If you press the skill to activate it, Mavuika spawns a ring that follows the active character. This ring will target a nearby enemy and hit all enemies within a range every 2 seconds, so it has a relatively big AoE. These hits don't have any elemental ICD, so she applies off-field pyro every 2 seconds. At C0, this turret lasts up to 12 seconds, hitting a total of 6 times. This serves as Mavuika's off-field pyro damage and application. If you hold Mavuika's skill to use it instead, however, she hops on her motorcycle. Exploration wise, while on her motorcycle, not only can Mavuika drive on land, but she can drive on water, up walls, and even fly like Molani, Shilonen, and Chaska. Combat wise, while on her motorcycle, Mavuika's normal, charged, and plunging attacks are enhanced. Even a dash will deal damage during this state. This serves as Mavuika's main DPS playstyle. While in either form, you can press skill again to swap between the two, or if you swap to another character while Mavuika is in her on-field motorcycle form, it will automatically swap to her off-field form. Next, Mavuika's elemental burst, which is a very important part of her kit. It has an 18-second cooldown, but for the first time in Genshin, the burst isn't charged via normal energy. Instead, just like how Acheron and Fei Xiao charge their ultimates differently in Honkai Star Rail, Mavuika charges her elemental burst with a unique resource called Fighting Spirit. Fighting Spirit can be obtained in 2 ways. First, whenever Night Soul points are consumed by any party member, they get converted into Fighting Spirit in a 1-to-1 ratio. Second, every normal attack from the party that hits an enemy gives 1.5 Fighting Spirit. Mavuika needs a minimum of 100 Fighting Spirit to use her burst, but she can hold up to 200. The more Fighting Spirit Mavuika has, the stronger the burst. Once the burst is used, Mavuika consumes all of her Fighting Spirit, gains 10 Night Soul points, deals a huge nuke of AoE damage, which increases based on the amount of Fighting Spirit consumed, and she gets on her motorcycle, entering Crucible of Life and Death for 7 seconds. This is a special state that gives Mavuika resistance to interruption, enhances the damage of all her on-field motorcycle attacks based on the amount of Fighting Spirit that was consumed, and pauses Mavuika's Night Soul consumption, allowing her on-field motorcycle attacks to not consume any Night Soul points for 7 seconds. In addition, with her A4 passive, using Mavuika's burst will give a decaying damage bonus buff for 20 seconds to the active character, depending on how much Fighting Spirit was consumed when using her burst. At max Fighting Spirit, this is a 40% damage bonus to the active character that slowly decays. Because Mavuika's burst does a huge nuke of damage, enhances her on-field damage, and gives a damage buff with her A4 passive, it is very important to have enough Fighting Spirit to not only use the burst, but to also use it with as much stacks as possible to gain its maximum damage buffs. With the max of 200 Fighting Spirit, Mavuika's burst reaches a near 1400 motion value, each of her normal and charged attacks gain about 100 and 200 motion value respectively, and the on-field character gains a decaying 40% damage bonus buff. Thus, getting a lot of Fighting Spirit stacks before using Mavuika's burst will be very important, and the best way to do so is through the consumption of Night Soul points. So, Mavuika really likes being played with other Notland characters. For Mavuika's remaining passive talents, her A1 gives her 30% attack for 10 seconds whenever Night Soul burst is triggered, and lastly, her exploration passives are the typical Night Soul transmission stuff, on top of reducing the cooldown of Night Soul transmission by 20%. That's everything on Mavuika's base kit. In terms of talent leveling priority, for both off-field support and on-field DPS mavuika, you'll want to level both the skill and burst eventually, but prioritize leveling her burst first. This is because not only does the burst buff the multipliers of her on-field motorcycle attacks, but also the burst's nuke of damage makes up a large part of mavuika's damage profile for both of her playstyles, especially when reacted. As for how to properly play mavuika, her specific rotations can vary depending on the team. This is because setting up the proper reactions for mavuika is important whether as a main DPS or support. There will be some optimized rotations shown in the team section, but for a simplified general gameplay rotation, there are two main ones. First is setting up your support skills, then switching to mavuika, bursting, pressing skill to max out her nitro points and switch to her off-field form, then swapping to your main DPS. Off-field support mavuika will generally use this rotation. The second rotation version is starting with mavuika's skill first, then setting up your support skills, then swapping back to mavuika to use her burst and perform her on-field motorcycle attacks. You can spam normal attacks, especially if you're using supports like Yelan, but her best combo on paper is 8 charged attacks with her final slash. If she still has time remaining in her motorcycle form, you can fit in some normal attacks before it ends, where you can then loop back to the beginning of your rotation. Main DPS mavuika will generally use this rotation. However, in some cases, you can use this rotation for a support mavuika. In this scenario, you wouldn't on-field mavuika after using her burst, but swap to your main DPS instead. Next, let's cover mavuika's constellations. C1 increases mavuika's maximum nitro points to 120, allows fighting spirit to be generated more quickly, and gives her 40% attack for 8 seconds after gaining fighting spirit. The attack buff is nice, and the increased fighting spirit generation is especially impactful for teams that don't normally generate the near max 200 fighting spirit. In addition, increasing mavuika's maximum nitro points increases the amount of time she can on-field, as well as increasing her potential off-field pyro uptime from 12 seconds at Z0 to 18 seconds with C1. With mavuika's skill having a 15-second cooldown, C1 gives her off-field pyro application full uptime. However, this isn't necessarily a good thing. For instance, imagine a team with Wriothesley, mavuika, and Shilonen. You can easily get a cryo crystallize with Shilonen on the first rotation to buff Wriothesley with 4P scroll, then use mavuika's skill to enable melts for Wriothesley. However, if mavuika's off-field pyro was permanently going and continuing to the next rotation, it would be impossible for Shilonen to proc another cryo crystallize to reactivate 4P scroll for Wriothesley. Thus, mavuika's skill not having full uptime at C0 is actually a good thing because it allows proper buff setup and uptime for rotations past the first. As a result, there are some cases where mavuika's C1 messes up certain setups. This isn't too much of a big deal as it can be played around, but I just wanted to mention this to emphasize that mavuika doesn't need full uptime on her off-field pyro. With mavuika's C2, when she's in Nightsoul's Blessing, her base attack increases by 200, her off-field form decreases nearby enemies' defenses by 20%, and her normal and charged on-field motorcycle attacks and her burst casts deal more damage. An extremely strong constellation that gives her a lot of damage. C3 increases her burst talent level by 3, C4 gives her A4 damage bonus buff to the active character an additional 10% and makes it no longer decay over time. So with C4, her A4 damage buff is a flat 50%. C5 increases her skill talent level by 3, and lastly C6 gives both her off-field and on-field forms additional hits of damage, as well as making mavuika's 20% death shred work on her own on-field damage. Keep in mind that these extra hits don't give mavuika additional pyro application. Additionally, with C6, her exploration movement gets both enhanced and an increased duration. Overall, C2 is the main attraction for people who want to invest more into mavuika. Here is a constellation comparison done by theory crafter Hyperwebster for both mavuika using Serpent Spine and her signature weapon. As you can see, in terms of early constellations, C2 will provide the biggest damage gain. C1 is a decent damage boost, but it could be more or less depending on the team, so if you aren't planning on getting C2, in my opinion, you would be better off using those pulls for her signature weapon instead. Speaking of her signature, here are the best builds for mavuika. Weapon choices are generally the same for both on-field and off-field playstyles. Mavuika's signature is her clear best in slot that gives her a ton of damage stats. It has very high base attack, crit rate substat, and the TLDR of the special passive is that it gives mavuika 35% crit damage and 49% attack after she uses her elemental skill or burst. Other 5-star weapons you can use as stat sticks include Beacon, Kenichi's signature, Verdict, and Wolf's Gravestone. For 4-star weapons, as always for Claymore DPSs, Serpent Spine is the best choice assuming you can maintain full stacks. Otherwise, the other Battle Pass Claymore, Talking Stick, is a good option, as well as Akuamaru for its burst damage buff. For free-to-play options, the Fontaine craftable Tidal Shadow is a good option assuming she gets healed. Typically, mavuika teams will have a healer. Another good option is the Melusine Claymore. Despite it having a useless ER main stat, it's still pretty good because of the attack percent that the passive gives. Mailed Flower is another free-to-play weapon that performs similarly. Now you may see other content creators say that this will be her clear best free-to-play weapon for reaction teams, as on paper, this weapon seems really good because it has an EM substat and gives additional attack and EM after Mavika's elemental skill hits an enemy or she triggers a reaction. The problem with Mailed Flower is that 1, it doesn't proc while Mavika is off field, and 2, in almost all of Mavika's main DPS rotations, she uses her skill first, then the support set up their skills, then Mavika uses her burst. By this time, Mailed Flower's passive is no longer active, so it doesn't buff Mavika's nuke of damage from her burst. But while Mailed Flower isn't her clear best free-to-play option, it's still really good. Lastly, if you don't have anything else, you could use the not long craftable claymore. However, because the majority of Mavika's damage is not elemental skill damage, this weapon's special passive is not that good, so I would recommend using another weapon. I didn't mention every single weapon you can use, only the ones I thought were notable, so here is a complete weapon comparison made by Hyperwebster for Mavika in their best melt team. Pause if you want to find the performance for a particular weapon. In terms of artifacts, for main DPS Mavika, you can use Marichusi Hunter if you're playing Mavika with Farina, but her best general set you should use is Obsidian Codex. One flaw that Obsidian Codex has is that its 4-piece set requires Night Soul point consumption, but Mavika's on-field motorcycle attacks after using her burst don't consume Night Soul points for 7 seconds. Fortunately, as long as you have Mavika's skill active for her off-field damage before swapping into her, bursting and on-fielding her, most of her attacks will still be buffed by the 4-piece set. For off-field support Mavika, 4-piece scroll is an obvious good choice. She doesn't benefit from the 2-piece, but the 4-piece team damage buff is always strong. There will be cases, however, where Mavika is in a team where another character can utilize 4-piece scroll better than her. In these scenarios, the best artifact choice for off-field Mavika will just be 4-piece Obsidian Codex. One major way that Mavika supports a team is providing a large amount of damage from her burst, so buffing the damage with 4-piece Codex will be the best option if you have another scroll user on the team. Based on an artifact comparison done by Hyperwebster, it is clear that Obsidian Codex is her best set for damage. Do keep in mind that for off-field support Mavika, if you need a 4-piece scroll user on the team, it will be Mavika's best set. For artifact stats, go for EM or Attack Hourglass, Pyro Goblet, and Crit Circlet. EM Hourglass will be better for reaction teams like Vapor Melt because Mavika has little sources of EM. Attack Hourglass is still good, especially in non-reaction teams, so just choose the one you have better substats for. In terms of substat priority, look for Crit, then EM for reaction teams, then attack percent. Remember that Mavika uses Fighting Spirit instead of normal energy to charge her burst, so energy recharge is a completely useless stat on her. Finally, let's go over Mavika's best team comps. First, main DPS Mavika teams. Because Mavika's burst initial hit has such a high multiplier, she performs especially well in reaction-based teams like Vape and Melt that can multiply her damage. And since her burst is a significant portion of her damage and buffs her on-field attacks, Mavika's teams need to generate Fighting Spirit, and the most efficient way to do so is through Night Soul point consumption. Mavika herself can produce up to 90 Fighting Spirit a rotation, as her skill gives 80 Night Soul points assuming she's at 0, and her burst gives 10. But to maximize her burst damage and buffs, you'll want to pair Mavika with Notlon teammates to help generate more Fighting Spirit. And there are 2 Notlon characters who are Mavika's best teammates by far. The first is Sitlali. Not only does she provide off-field cryo to allow Mavika to melt her attacks, but she also buffs her damage with her Pyro Res Shred, TTDS, and is the best 4-piece scroll holder for her, along with providing a small shield. Although Sitlali alone is theoretically able to allow Mavika to melt her burst and 4 of her charged attacks, the timing for this to happen is ping dependent, precise, and unrealistic, so in general, solo Sitlali will only allow Mavika to melt her burst and 2 of her charged attacks. But despite this, Sitlali is one of Mavika's best teammates and will be a must if you want to play Mavika's strong melt teams. The second Notlon teammate that synergizes well with Mavika is Shilonen. I think everyone already knows how good Shilonen is with her Res Shred and healing. She's also a 4-piece scroll holder, but if someone like Sitlali is on the team who holds scroll better, Shilonen can use Archaic Petra to bring more buffs. However, one of the biggest benefits of Shilonen is her Night Soul point generation. Most Notlon characters require an entire rotation to occur in order to consume their Night Soul points. With Shilonen's kit, however, she instantly generates and consumes 90 Night Soul points instantly when she presses skill and 2 normal attacks to activate her Res Shred. If you use her burst in between, she consumes close to 100. This front loading of Fighting Spirit generation makes it very easy to charge Mavika's burst, and combined with her Res Shred, Shilonen is the best general Notlon teammate for Mavika that works in a lot of teams. You don't need both Sitlali and Shilonen for Mavika to be an amazing DPS. Generally, to access her best teams, you will just need one or the other. Mavika's best team on paper though does run both Sitlali and Shilonen alongside Bennett for his attack buff. This melt team is literally just putting some of the best buffers in the game for Mavika, and the result is the new highest damaging team on paper. Now if you don't want to use Bennett with the Sitlali Shilonen core, you can replace him with an anima support like Sucrose or a second cryo offfielder like Rosaria or Kaya. Because Mavuika has little sources of EM, Sucrose is generally better than Kazuha, though Kazuha can still be used. Running double cryo does make Mavuika melting 4 charged attacks more achievable. However, you do lose out on buffs and have to deal with other issues such as Rosaria's circle or Kaya's low range. If you don't have Shilonen but are planning to have Sitlali, you can replace Shilonen with the anima support or second cryo slot and you'll still have a strong melt team enabled by Sitlali. Now if you have Shilonen but don't plan on pulling Sitlali, her melt teams won't be as good. Sitlali's best replacement however is Farina. Paired with Shilonen and Bennett, this is Mavuika's best vape team on paper. Running double Hydro instead of Bennett is also an option. Just remember to spam normal attacks on Mavuika and not her charged attacks when using a support like Elan. Mavuika can even work decently in a non-reaction team like Monopyro by brute forcing with raw damage, though these teams will generally be worse than reaction-based teams. Now the biggest concern for Mavuika's main DPS teams is if you don't have Shilonen or Sitlali. The reality is that if you don't have either of these characters, you cannot access most of Mavuika's best teams and her team building will be much more limited. However, she does have some options. You could just force a plunge vape team with Shenyun and Farina and bursting every other rotation with Mavuika. However, the best looking option on paper is a Chevreuse Overload team with Auroron. Because Mavuika deals Night Soul aligned damage, she can activate Auroron's off-field damage herself without needing Electrocharge. Though Auroron doesn't consume as much Night Soul points as Sitlali or Shilonen, you still get a good amount of fighting spirit with him and Mavuika. And with Auroron being the only Electro character on the team, he has Soul Overload ownership, making full EM Auroron potentially better than his normal crit build. Now other than that, your only other options are using